Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. China has built a passenger jet designed from day one to end Boeing, and Airbus's 40-year grip on the narrow-body market. It has government backing that most manufacturers can only dream of. It has a home market of 1.4 billion people and a state airline system ready to buy every single unit it can produce. And after more than a decade of development, after billions of dollars, after a maiden flight that Chinese state media treated like a moon landing, exactly 0 foreign airlines fly it. Not one international carrier outside China has put this aircraft into commercial service. So what happened? Why did the plane built to break the duopoly end up unable to leave its own borders? Let's actually dig into it, because the real answer is stranger and more revealing about how global aviation actually works than most people assume. The aircraft is the COMAC C919, built by the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China. And on paper, it looks like exactly the kind of narrow-body that should be selling worldwide. It's a single-aisle jet built to go head-to-head with the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320neo, the two aircraft families that between them dominate short and medium-haul flying across the entire planet. To understand how big a bet this program actually was, you have to go back to where it started. COMAC officially announced the C919 program in January 2009, at a time when China had essentially no independent modern commercial aircraft industry to speak of. The original plan called for a maiden flight in 2014 and first deliveries as early as 2016. Anyone who has followed large aircraft programs anywhere in the world knows how that story usually goes, and the C919 was no exception. The maiden flight didn't happen until May 2017, 3 years late, and the aircraft didn't actually enter revenue passenger service until May 2023, nearly 7 years behind the original delivery target. That's not a uniquely Chinese problem, to be fair. Boeing's 787 was roughly 3 years late. Airbus's A320 slipped 2. Building a clean-sheet commercial jet to modern safety standards is simply one of the hardest engineering and industrial management challenges in existence. And China discovered that the hard way, just like everyone else who has ever tried it. China Eastern Airlines took delivery of the very first production C919 back in December 2022, and the type entered scheduled commercial service in May 2023. That alone was a genuine milestone. China had, for the first time in its history, put a domestically developed jetliner built to modern international airworthiness standards into daily passenger service. Since then, the aircraft has quietly built up a real operational record. It has carried more than 4 million passengers across dozens of domestic routes, and during peak travel periods, it has operated well over 4,000 flights in a matter of weeks. Now, this is not a paper airplane sitting in a hangar for photo opportunities. It is flying every day, carrying real passengers on real Chinese domestic routes. So the plane clearly works. The engineering is not the problem. The problem is somewhere else entirely, and it comes down to a single word that most passengers never think about: certification. Here's the part of aviation that almost nobody outside the industry understands, and it's the key to this entire story. Building an airplane that flies safely is only half the job. The other half is convincing the world's aviation regulators that it flies safely, and that second half can take longer and cost more than actually designing the aircraft in the first place. In global aviation, there are effectively two gatekeepers whose approval unlocks the rest of the planet: the United States Federal Aviation Administration and the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA. If either of those two regulators certifies an aircraft type, dozens of other countries around the world will accept that certification and allow the aircraft to fly in their airspace without redoing the entire safety review from scratch. It's essentially a trust network built up over decades of shared standards, shared incident investigation data, and shared engineering rigor. China's own aviation regulator, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, or CAAC, has certified the C919 as airworthy, and that certificate is exactly why Chinese airlines can fly it domestically today. But CAAC certification, on its own, does not open the door to Europe, does not open the door to the United States, and does not open the door to the dozens of countries whose own aviation authorities default to following EASA or FAA judgment rather than running an independent review of every foreign aircraft type. Without one of those two stamps of approval, the C919 is, for nearly all practical purposes, locked out of the routes that would actually make it a threat to Boeing and Airbus on the global stage. So where does that certification process actually stand right now? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because COMAC has been trying to crack this door open for years, and the timeline keeps sliding. EASA test pilots have been flying the C919 directly, conducting validation sorties out of Shanghai to examine handling characteristics, flight control logic, and documentation. As of early 2026, European regulators have stationed technical staff in Shanghai for extended periods, essentially setting up a semi-permanent certification outpost to accelerate the review. That sounds like real progress, and in a narrow technical sense, it is. But listen to what EASA's own leadership has said about the timeline. The agency's executive director told a French industry publication that certification would not happen in 2025, and that a realistic window was 3 to 6 years out. By the middle of 2025, European regulators were telling reporters that certification was unlikely before 2028 and could realistically slip as far as 2031. Let that sink in. COMAC originally hoped to have European approval by 2025. The honest current estimate from the regulator itself is sometime between 2028 and 2031. That's not a rounding error in a schedule. That's the goalposts moving by the better part of a decade. And the FAA side of the equation is arguably worse because, as of now, COMAC isn't even actively pursuing American certification at all, given the current state of tension between Washington and Beijing, and given that the Pentagon has formally placed COMAC on a list of companies linked to China's military-industrial complex. There is essentially no realistic path to FAA certification in the current geopolitical climate, and COMAC appears to know it, which is why the company's certification energy is going almost entirely toward Europe instead. Without a credible path to either Western regulator, entire regions of the aviation world simply aren't in play for this aircraft, no matter how well it flies. So, if COMAC can't get through the front door, has it found any side doors? A little, and this part of the story is worth understanding because it shows how the company is actually trying to work around the wall rather than through it. Rather than waiting on EASA or the FAA, COMAC has been courting individual countries directly, persuading their national aviation authorities to simply recognize CAAC certification on its own terms, without requiring EASA or FAA sign-off first. Brunei made that move in October 2025, adding CAAC to the list of regulators it accepts, alongside its existing recognition of EASA, the FAA, and Transport Canada. Vietnam has taken a similar step. These are real developments, and they matter, but let's be honest about the scale here. These are small aviation markets. They are not going to move the needle against a duopoly that dominates commercial aviation from Frankfurt to Dallas to Singapore. Think of it less like COMAC breaking down the wall, separating it from the global market, and more like COMAC collecting a handful of individual passport stamps from countries willing to grant them, one at a time, while the major markets that actually matter for global scale remain firmly closed. As of early 2026, no non-Chinese airline had placed the aircraft into commercial passenger service anywhere in the world, aside from a limited charter appearance in Hong Kong. Now, certification is only half of this story, and honestly, it might not even be the more surprising half. Because even if the certification wall came down tomorrow, the C919 would still be running into a second, much more uncomfortable problem. It isn't actually as Chinese as the marketing around it suggests. This is the part that tends to genuinely surprise people who haven't followed the program closely. The C919 was built from the very beginning around a deeply international supply chain, leaning heavily on exactly the same Western suppliers that power Boeing and Airbus aircraft. The engines are the clearest example. The C919 flies on the CFM LEAP-1C, a turbofan built by a joint venture between America's GE Aerospace and France's Safran, the very same engine family, in different variants. The AT powers the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737 MAX. The avionics and flight control systems draw heavily on components from Honeywell Aerospace and Collins Aerospace, a subsidiary of the American defense giant RTX. In other words, the aircraft China built specifically to reduce its dependence on the West is, mechanically, still deeply dependent on the West for some of its most critical systems. And in 2025, that dependency turned from an abstract risk into a very real production crisis. In late May of that year, the United States Department of Commerce suspended export licenses covering the technology American companies use to supply engines and relate D-components to COMAC. For roughly 5 weeks, GE Aerospace could not legally ship LEAP-1C engines to China, and the export freeze also hit the Honeywell and Collins avionics supply lines. Production didn't just slow down. For a stretch in June and July of 2025, it effectively stalled entirely. The ban was lifted at the start of July, and shipments resumed. But the disruption left a lasting backlog that COMAC is still working through more than a year later. Industry analysts have been blunt about what that episode revealed. The C919's supply chain, in the words of one aviation consultancy's head of research, is inherently sensitive to political shifts, which is about as polite a way as you can phrase, a single decision in Washington can shut down a Chinese national aviation program for over a month. COMAC has since built up a stockpile of engines and critical components as a buffer against future disruptions, but by most independent estimates, that buffer covers a matter of months of production, not years. If Washington decided to flip that switch again for a longer stretch, the program would be right back where it was in June 2025. China is unsurprisingly working on an exit from that dependency, and this is where the story connects to something bigger than just one airplane. The Aero Engine Corporation of China, AECC, is developing a fully domestic replacement for the LEAP 1C called the CJ1000. It's meant to match the performance class of the engine it would replace, and Chinese state media has covered its development with the same pride usually reserved for major space missions. But the honest engineering timeline here is sobering. Independent estimates suggest the domestic engine isn't likely to achieve its own certification before 2027 at the earliest, and meaningful production volume, enough to actually power a growing C919 fleet, isn't expected until around 2030. Until then, every single C919 airframe rolling off the line remains tied to an engine supply chain that runs directly through a U.S. export licensing office that has already demonstrated its willingness to shut the tap off once. So let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the gap between ambition and reality becomes almost uncomfortable to look at directly. At a supplier conference in March 2025, COMAC laid out a production ramp that sounded genuinely industry-changing on paper. 100 aircraft delivered in 2026, 150 in about both 2027 and 2028, and 200 a year by 2029. Those are Boeing and Airbus scale numbers, the kind of output that would genuinely start reshaping global narrow-body market share. Now compare that to what actually happened. In 2025, against an original target of 75 deliveries for the year, COMAC delivered approximately 15 aircraft. Not 75, 15. That's a miss of roughly 80% against the company's own stated goal. Heading into 2026, Chinese airlines themselves, Air China, China Eastern, and China Southern, were projecting a combined 33 deliveries for the year, doubling the prior year's output, but still landing at barely a third of COMAC's own 100 aircraft target. And even that more modest number came under pressure. Reporting from mid-2026 showed the program stalling again, with only a handful of units shipped across an entire quarter, with analysts pointing directly back at the same bottleneck. Engines simply not arriving in time, leaving completed airframes sitting on the ground with bare wings, waiting for the power plants that turn them into functioning aircraft. Independent aviation consultancy IBA has been consistently more conservative than COMAC's own projections throughout this entire period, forecasting roughly 25 deliveries for 2026, rising to somewhere around 45 in 2027, and only reaching something like 90 a year by 2030, less than half of what COMAC told its own suppliers to expect. By way of comparison, Airbus alone is targeting roughly 700 A320 family deliveries in 2026. Boeing, despite years of very public production and quality struggles, is still expected to deliver somewhere around 510 737 MAX aircraft in that same year. Put the C919 next to those numbers, and even the more optimistic independent forecasts put it at something like 2% of global narrow-body output by the time it reaches its 2030 peak. That is not the profile of an aircraft that is threatening the duopoly. That is the profile of a genuinely important national program, still working out fundamental supply chain and manufacturing scale problems. There's also a quieter structural signal buried in the delivery data that's worth pointing out, because it tells you who COMAC can actually sell to right now versus who it needs to sell to eventually. Every single C919 delivered so far has gone to one of exactly 3 customers: Air China, China Eastern, and China Southern, the 3 state-linked flag carriers of China itself. That's not really a commercial order book in the normal sense of the term. It's closer to a coordinated national procurement program, where the government effectively assigns aircraft to its own airlines, regardless of what the pure commercial math might otherwise suggest. There is nothing wrong with that as an industrial policy. It's a legitimate way to build up manufacturing scale and operational experience before attempting an export push. And to be fair, it's not wildly different in spirit from how some other national aviation champions got their start decades ago, leaning on protected home markets before ever testing themselves against open international competition. But it does mean the headline order backlog, numbers you sometimes see quoted in the hundreds or even over 1,000 aircraft, need serious context, because the overwhelming majority of those are domestic Chinese commitments, not the kind of diversified international customer base that would actually prove the aircraft has a real global market beyond its home turf. There's an interesting side effect of this domestic-only reality worth pointing out too. Because COMAC doesn't need to win over skeptical foreign fleet planners just to keep the assembly line moving, the company has, in a sense, been shielded from the kind of brutal commercial pressure that normally forces aircraft manufacturers to sharpen their pricing, their support networks, and their reliability records extremely quickly. Chinese state airlines are going to keep taking C919 deliveries more or less regardless of how the export story unfolds, because the government has every incentive to keep the program alive and the fleet growing. That's a comfortable position in some ways, but it's also a trap. A manufacturer that only ever has to satisfy one buyer, its own government, never really gets tested the way Boeing and Airbus get tested every single day by airlines all over the world, comparing fuel burn, maintenance costs, and dispatch reliability across competing aircraft types. Whether that captive domestic market ends up being the foundation COMAC needs to eventually go global or comfortable cushion that lets real competitiveness problems go unaddressed for years is genuinely an open question, and probably won't be answerable until the certification wall actually comes down and the C919 has to survive its first real head-to-head sales campaign against a 737 MAX or an A320neo on foreign soil. And when you look at where genuine foreign interest has actually shown up, it's been cautious, exploratory, and almost entirely symbolic so far, rather than commercial. Airlines in Southeast Asia, carriers based in countries like Indonesia and around the broader region, have expressed interest in evaluating the type, and there have been scattered charter appearances and demonstration flights designed to generate exactly this kind of headline. Malaysia's flag carrier has been discussed in industry analysis as a plausible future candidate, given its regional geography and existing ties to the Chinese market, but even that kind of coverage is explicit that any real fleet decision would hinge entirely on Western certification actually landing first. Because without ESA or FAA validation, an airline risks losing route flexibility into markets that require it. Nobody serious is placing binding commercial orders for an aircraft that still can't legally fly into most of the world's major aviation markets. That's not customers being stubborn or anti-China. That's just basic fleet planning risk management. An airline buying dozens of narrow-body jets is committing to a relationship that runs for 2, sometimes 3 decades. Spare parts, pilot training, maintenance infrastructure, resale value, all of it. Betting that on an aircraft whose certification timeline in your target markets is measured in maybe 2028, maybe 2031, we'll see, is not a decision most airline CFOs are willing to make, no matter how competitive the sticker price looks. It's also worth understanding that COMAC isn't putting all its eggs in a single aircraft variant, which tells you something about how the company itself is thinking about the market it can realistically access versus the one it eventually wants. Beyond the baseline C919, there's an extended range version, sometimes referred to as the C919-100ER, which stretches range out to roughly 5,155 kilometers through a higher maximum takeoff weight and a more powerful variant of the LEAP 1C engine. Air China took delivery of the first of those in August 2024 and currently operates it exclusively. There's also a genuinely clever niche variant called the C919-600, a shortened fuselage model specifically engineered for high-altitude airport operations, the kind of thin air conditions that make takeoff and landing performance dramatically harder for any jet. That variant strips out roughly 6 fuselage frames to reduce weight and is aimed at airports sitting at extreme elevations, including some of the highest commercial airports on the planet, tucked into the Tibetan Plateau region. Its first prototype rolled out in Shanghai in January 2026. Interestingly, that aircraft isn't even really competing with the mainline 737 or A320 at all. Its real rival is the smaller Airbus A319neo in a genuinely specialized corner of the market where geography, not politics, decides the winner. All of this variant development tells you COMAC is playing a long, patient game, building out a family of aircraft the way Boeing and Airbus did decades ago, rather than betting everything on a single configuration. So if you zoom all the way out, here's the shape of the real story. And it's a more interesting one than a simple David versus Goliath narrative about China taking on Boeing and Airbus. The C919 is not fake. It's not vaporware. It is a real, flying, functioning aircraft carrying millions of real passengers, safely across China's domestic network every single day. And that alone is a genuine engineering and industrial achievement that took China more than a decade and untold billions of dollars to reach. But the aircraft is currently trapped between 2 very different obstacles that have almost nothing to do with whether it's a good airplane. The first is a regulatory wall that has nothing to do with engineering quality and everything to do with the decades-long trust architecture that governs which countries accept which certifications, a wall that is sliding further away rather than closer with every passing year of geopolitical tension. The second is a supply chain that, ironically, still runs directly through the same American and European companies that COMAC was ultimately trying to reduce its dependence on in the first place, which means the aircraft built to insulate China from Western leverage is, for now, still deeply exposed to it. Whether the C919 eventually breaks out of China and becomes a genuine third player in the global narrow-body market probably comes down to two separate races happening at the same time, and neither of them has a guaranteed outcome. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding, because it shows you how COMAC itself is thinking about the next decade, not just the current program. The company isn't just trying to fix the C919's export problem. It's already planning the next aircraft in line, a wide-body called the C929, aimed much more directly at the long-haul market, currently split between the Boeing 787 and the Airbus A350. Industry reporting from mid-2025 indicated COMAC is targeting a stretched version of the C919 to enter service by around 2030, with the C929 widebody following by roughly 2035. Think about what that timeline actually implies. COMAC is essentially betting that by the time the C929 needs Western certification in a genuinely global supply chain of its own, the lessons learned from the C919's export struggles, and hopefully a mature domestic engine program, will already be in place. In other words, the C919 isn't just a commercial aircraft in its own right. It's also functioning as a very expensive, very public dress rehearsal for a much bigger ambition, competing in the wide-body long-haul market, the segment, with the fattest profit margins and the most prestigious routes in the entire industry. Every certification lesson learned in Shanghai with ESA test pilots right now, every supply chain vulnerability exposed by the 2025 export freeze, every delivery target missed and recalibrated, all of it is data. COMAC is almost certainly folding into how it approaches the C929 a decade from now. That's either a sign of serious long-term strategic patience or a sign that China is choosing to relearn the same hard lessons twice, once on a narrow body and once on a wide body, depending on how charitably you want to read it. Those two races together will determine the C919's real fate. The first is the race to get real ESA certification actually finalized, rather than perpetually 6 months away, which realistically means sometime in the back half of this decade at the very earliest, if the current trajectory holds. The second is the race to get the domestic CJ1000 engine into full production, freeing the aircraft from its reliance on an export license that a single agency in Washington can suspend with a signature. Until both of those things actually happen, not get announced, not get tested, actually happen and stick, the C919 is going to remain exactly what it is today. An impressive national achievement, a genuinely capable airplane, and for the rest of the world outside China's own borders, essentially unbuyable. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Is the C919 actually on track to eventually challenge Boeing and Airbus once certification and engine independence finally arrive? Or is this always going to be a fundamentally domestic project, one that serves China's own airlines and China's own industrial ambitions perfectly well without ever needing to win over the rest of the world at all? Drop your take in the comments, because the answer to that question is going to shape how the entire narrow-body market looks a decade from now.